She read the message once, then again, then a third time, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. Something cold settled into her stomach, a sensation like swallowing ice water. Her hands remained steady as she activated the motion detection system, placing herself in the queue to speak. 47 delegates ahead of her. She waited, hands clasped behind her back, face composed into perfect diplomatic neutrality, while her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she could feel her pulse in her temples. When her turn finally arrived, nearly an hour later, after listening to 3 separate delegates debate the proper taxation rate for deuterium shipments, her voice emerged steady and professional, transmitted simultaneously into 4,000 languages by the Chamber's translation systems. "Honored delegates," she began, and the words echoed through that vast crystalline bowl. "I bring urgent matter before this council." A few delegates in the middle rings glanced in her direction. Most continued their private conversations, barely noticing the interruption. Approximately 9 hours ago, all communication with the human colony of New Geneva was lost. She kept her voice level, each word precisely enunciated. New Geneva is home to 1.2 million human citizens, including families and children. We have received no distress signal, no evacuation confirmation, no automated emergency broadcasts. The colony has simply gone silent. Now she had more attention. Delegates in the inner rings were looking up from their data tablets. "We are requesting immediate council assistance in determining what has happened to our people." The chamber settled into a particular quality of silence that only large groups of beings could produce, the sound of thousands of individuals collectively deciding whether something warranted their concern. Speaker Ithron tilted his angular head, mandibles clicking in a rhythm that Lena's earpiece translated as mild irritation. "The council acknowledges the concern of the human delegation," he intoned, his voice carrying all the warmth of a tax audit notification. "The matter will be recorded and reviewed by the appropriate subcommittee for potential future action." Lena felt her jaw tighten. She forced it to relax. "With respect, Speaker, I am not asking for a subcommittee review. I am asking for immediate help. Over 1 million people may be in danger at this very moment." Ithron regarded her the way an adult might regard a child who had interrupted an important conversation. "The council has noted your request, Ambassador Vasquez. It will be tabled for future consideration. You may return to your seat." Lena looked out across the chamber, across the thousands of delegates representing civilizations that had mapped the stars while humans were still learning to make fire. She searched for one pair of eyes, one gesture, one single indication that someone, anyone, cared that 1 million human beings might be dying. She found nothing but polite disinterest. She sat down with deliberate care, as if moving too quickly might shatter something inside her. Her fingers moved across her data tablet, composing a message to Earth that began with the words, "They will not help us." It ended with, "We need to prepare for the worst." High above her in the inner rings, Trade Voice Maluri of the Danari Collective watched the human ambassador with those enormous, light-absorbing eyes. She felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, a small, cold whisper of instinct from deep in her amphibian hindbrain that said, "Pay attention to this one. Pay very close attention to what happens next." But she remained silent. Speaking would have meant expending political capital on a species that possessed none. And the Danari had not dominated galactic commerce for 10,000 years by making poor investments. The session continued. The galaxy turned. Somewhere in the black distance between stars, a colony of 1.2 million souls had already been reduced to ash and glass and silence. Nobody in that grand and ancient chamber knew it yet. Nobody except perhaps the humans themselves, who carried in their bones an instinct for catastrophe, a feeling they could never quite articulate to species that hadn't evolved on a world actively trying to kill them. A world where the weather could murder you, where the animals viewed you as food, where the ground itself could open without warning and swallow you whole. The only reason humanity had survived at all was because they had learned, very early in their evolutionary history, that when danger struck, you didn't look away. You looked straight at it. You remembered its face, and you made absolutely certain it could never hurt you again. The reconnaissance fleet arrived at New Geneva 14 hours after the colony went silent. Captain Dara Osei stood on the bridge of her ship, the UES Pathfinder, and felt reality fracture. That was the only way to describe it. The sensation of the universe cracking along invisible fault lines, revealing something underneath that should never have been exposed to light. The first thing she noticed was a smell. This should have been impossible. Space was a vacuum. Ships were sealed environments. But the sensors were analyzing particulate matter from the debris field surrounding the planet, translating that data into atmospheric composition reports. And somewhere in her brain, the numbers were being processed as scent. The smell of burning, of cooked rock, of organic compounds flash-heated beyond recognition. The smell of a world that had been alive and was now profoundly, irreversibly dead. New Geneva had been a garden colony, selected specifically for its Earth-like biosphere. Rolling hills covered in grass that turned golden in autumn. Warm oceans teeming with native life that the colonists had been carefully studying, learning to coexist with. Cities built low and spread wide, because the settlers had come from Switzerland and Japan and New Zealand, and they carried with them an old earth reverence for landscapes and open sky. They had built a home that looked like a painting. Now it looked like a wound. The surface was glass. Not metaphorically, literally transformed into glass. Vast stretches of it where temperatures hot enough to liquefy stone had washed across continents, turning everything, forests, cities, rivers, people, into a flat, shining nothing that reflected starlight like an enormous broken mirror. Captain Osei stood before the main view screen, unable to speak, unable to look away, unable to process what her eyes were showing her. Behind her, her communications officer was crying with quiet, dignified grief, tears streaming down her face as she continued monitoring channels that would never transmit again. Osei didn't tell her to stop. There was nothing unprofessional about weeping for the dead, not when the dead numbered 1.2 million and included approximately 200,000 children. The fleet spread across the system, sensors sweeping, data accumulating into a picture that grew progressively worse with each passing hour. The orbital stations had been destroyed first, blown apart with heavy weapons fire that left characteristic energy signatures in the wreckage, signatures the fleet's tactical AI immediately flagged as familiar, pulling matches from the galactic database. Then the surface bombardment had begun, some kind of plasma weapon, directed with surgical precision at every population center, every piece of infrastructure, every location where humans might gather. The weapon hadn't just destroyed, it had sterilized, ensuring nothing would ever grow there again. The escape pods had been targeted individually, every single one. The scan teams found wreckage scattered across the planet's night side in a pattern that told a story more horrible than any formal report could convey. People had tried to flee, and they had been hunted down one by one with the patience of a predator that enjoyed the chase. Then the ground teams found the message. It was burned into the largest glass plane on the northern continent, carved with energy weapons in letters 3 kilometers tall, written in trade common, so anyone who came looking would be able to read it. Soft flesh, sweet fear. We will return for more. Captain Osei read those words, and something fundamental shifted behind her eyes. Something that anyone from a younger species might not have recognized, but that any human would have understood immediately. It was the expression of a person who had stopped being afraid and started being something else entirely. Something older, deeper, more primal. Something that had carried humanity through 300,000 years on a planet that viewed them as prey. The energy signatures matched profiles in the galactic database almost immediately. The identification came back within minutes. Crevon, a species of nomadic raiders who had terrorized the outer regions of the galaxy for over 8,000 years. Reptilian predators who traveled in massive fleet swarms, descending on vulnerable worlds to harvest biomass, resources, and slaves. They had survived for so long because the Galactic Council had never considered them worth the effort of eliminating. The Crevon were classified in Council records as a persistent minor threat. The recommended response to their raids was avoidance and acceptable loss management, a bureaucratic euphemism that meant the galaxy's great powers had decided long ago it was cheaper to let the Crevon eat the weak than to spend resources stopping them. New Geneva had been a soft target, a young colony with minimal orbital defenses, inhabited by a species of galaxy considered barely worth noticing. The Crevon had seen it the way a predator sees a lamb separated from a herd. Captain Osei transmitted her findings to Luna Command and to Ambassador Vasquez on Athenium Prime. Then she sat in her command chair and waited, her hands folded with deliberate calm, while inside her chest something dark and ancient was waking up. On Athenium Prime, Lena Vasquez received a report in her private quarters. She read through the initial summary, the casualty estimates, the forensic analysis. She studied the images, the glass planes, the destroyed escape pods, the message burned into a dead world. Then she looked at the translation of that message one more time. Soft flesh, sweet fear. We will return for more. She sat alone for exactly 4 minutes with her eyes closed and her fists clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. In those 4 minutes, she allowed herself to feel everything. The rage, the grief, the bottomless horror knowing that 200,000 children had been murdered by creatures who left messages boasting about it. Then she washed her hands, straightened her uniform, and walked to the Grand Deliberation Chamber to request an emergency session. The chamber was only half full. Most delegates consider human business beneath their attention, but enough were present to constitute a quorum. Lena stood at the central speaking platform for the first time in her 3 years as ambassador, right there in the middle of that enormous crystal bowl where the galaxy's most powerful beings delivered their pronouncements. She laid out the evidence methodically, letting the data speak for itself. She showed them the glass planes where cities had stood. She showed them the wreckage of escape pods, shot down one by one. She showed them the energy signatures, confirming Crevon involvement. She showed them the message, and she translated it for anyone whose systems hadn't already done so. Soft flesh, sweet fear, we will return for more. Then she made her formal request, a joint council military response against Crevon to prevent further attacks on member worlds. Speaker Ithron listened with his 4 compound eyes fixed on her in an expression the human xenopsychology team had long ago identified as polite disinterest. When she finished, he opened the floor to discussion. The discussion lasted less than an hour. The Veltari position was delivered by Ithron himself. He stood at the platform and explained, in the same tone one might use to discuss quarterly projections, that the loss of one colony of one minor species, while regrettable, did not constitute a threat to galactic stability. The Crevon had been raiding frontier worlds for millennia without ever threatening the core systems. A military response would be costly and would set a precedent the Council could not afford. One colony of 1 million beings is a statistical irrelevance, he said, the words translated into 4,000 languages simultaneously. He delivered this assessment without emotion, without hesitation, as if the number 1 million carried no weight when measured against political convenience. The Crevon will move on, as they always do. This is simply the price of expansion into unprotected space. The vote was called. The motion failed. 3,891 against, 309 in favor. Lena watched the numbers appear on the display above the platform. She felt each vote like a physical blow, each number another door slamming shut. She stood there as the chamber began to fill with the ambient noise of delegates turning to other business, already forgetting, already moving on. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the noise with an edge that made several nearby delegates physically flinch. Then we will handle it ourselves. The chamber quieted, not because anyone was particularly interested, but because the translation systems had flagged something unusual in her vocal patterns. Elevated stress hormones, increased blood flow, a biochemical signature that most galactic species had only read about in academic studies of predator behavior on deathworlds. Lena looked up at the rising rings of seats, at the thousands of faces representing civilizations older than human recorded history. And when we do, she continued, her voice perfectly level, remember that we asked you first. She walked out without waiting for a response. Behind her, delegates exchanged glances, made small sounds of confusion or amusement or dismissal. What could one minor species possibly do that would matter to anyone? In the back rows of the Danari section, trade voice Maluri watched the human ambassador leave. Then she quietly opened a secure channel to Danari intelligence and said 4 words that would later be cited in every historical analysis of what followed. Watch the humans closely. The footage from New Geneva reached Earth on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday evening, the entire species had changed. It wasn't sudden, like a switch being flipped. It was more like watching the ocean pull back on the shore before a tsunami. That long, terrible pause where the water retreats and the sand is exposed and everything becomes very quiet and very still. Anyone who understood what they were watching knew that something enormous and unstoppable was about to happen. The images spread across every network, every feed, every public display on every human world. The military didn't try to contain them. Glass planes stretching to the horizon, where cities had stood. Wreckage of escape pods scattered like broken toys. The message burned into the earth in letters visible from orbit. Every human being who saw those images felt something shift inside them, something deep and old and shared, a feeling their ancestors would have recognized immediately. The feeling a wolf pack gets when one of its own has been killed. The United Earth Parliament convened an emergency session within 24 hours. Every single representative was present, something that hadn't happened since the founding of the body 60 years ago. The gallery was packed. The streets outside overflowed with citizens. The feeds were being watched by every human being on every human world simultaneously. 16 billion people holding their breath. General Amara Stone of Lena Command stood before Parliament and presented two operational plans. The first was designated Operation Measured Step, a targeted strike against a Crevon raiding fleet responsible for New Geneva, a proportional military response designed to punish the attackers and deter future aggression, while minimizing resource expenditure and political risk. It was a kind of plan any reasonable civilization would consider appropriate, measured, and sane. The second was Operation Carthage. General Stone explained it simply because the plan itself was simple in the way a sledgehammer is simple. What she described was a complete and total destruction of the Crevon as a spacefaring civilization. Not a raid, not a punitive strike, not a police action. A full-scale military campaign targeting every Crevon shipyard, every weapons factory, every military installation, every fleet anchorage, every piece of infrastructure that allowed them to leave their home systems and prey on others. She explained that the operation would require deploying approximately 14,000 warships, that it would involve simultaneous strikes across 5 star systems, that Earth's intelligence services had spent the last 11 years quietly mapping every aspect of Crevon military infrastructure because humanity's strategic planners had always operated on the assumption that eventually something like this would happen, because humans had a word for that kind of thinking. The word was paranoia, and paranoia had kept them alive on a death world for 300,000 years. When she finished her presentation, the Speaker of Parliament opened the floor for debate. There was no debate. The vote was called, and Operation Carthage was approved unanimously. Every single representative, every party, every faction, every political philosophy united behind a single decision with a clarity of purpose that stunned even the generals who had proposed it. The mobilization began within hours. Hidden shipyards activated throughout the asteroid belt. Facilities that had been built in secret over the past decade, buried inside hollowed-out asteroids and shielded from detection by the same stealth technology Earth used for its intelligence satellites. These shipyards hadn't been building cargo vessels or exploration craft. They had been building weapons. The ships that emerged were not beautiful. They were not elegant. They weren't designed to impress anyone at diplomatic functions. They were built the way humans built everything that truly mattered: practical, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. Each one was a machine designed for a single purpose, with no waste of material and no waste of thought. The weapons those ships carried were technologies the galaxy didn't know existed, because humanity had never mentioned them. Gravity lances that could tear the hull of a capital ship apart by creating localized singularities that shredded matter at the molecular level. Antimatter torpedo swarms operating on hive intelligence, capable of coordinating attacks across an entire star system in real time. Self-replicating hunter-killer drones that could be deployed by the thousands to systematically dismantle any target they were pointed at with surgical precision. And something called the Ember. The Ember was a planet cracker, a device that could destabilize the core of a rocky world and tear it apart from the inside. It existed because someone on a classified weapons committee had once asked, "What if we need to make a point that can be seen from another star system?" Nobody in the room had been able to argue that the question was unreasonable. Admiral Roshan Cade was given command of the fleet. A quiet man with dark eyes and a reputation for two things: absolute tactical brilliance and an almost unsettling calm under pressure that his colleagues attributed to either meditation or some fundamental neurological difference nobody had been able to identify. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, the UES Remembrance, and looked at the tactical display, showing 14,000 warships forming up in the darkness between Mars and Jupiter. He felt the weight of what was about to happen settle onto his shoulders like a coat made of iron. Behind him, his communications officer reported that the fleet was receiving messages from every human world, billions of individual transmissions flooding in. "What do they say?" Cade asked quietly. The officer was silent for a moment, scrolling through the messages. "They all say the same thing, sir. In different words, but the same thing, which is, remember New Geneva." On Athenium Prime, Galactic Intelligence Services were beginning to notice unusual activity in human space. Energy signatures consistent with large-scale fleet movement. Communications traffic that had increased by 8,000% in 48 hours. And a sudden, complete silence from all human diplomatic channels that was somehow more alarming than anything they might have said. The Veltari Intelligence Service sent a classified report to Speaker Ithron, noting that humans appear to be mobilizing for a significant military operation, and that the scale of the mobilization was inconsistent with their known capabilities, which meant either the intelligence was wrong or the humans had been hiding things. Neither possibility was comforting. Ithron summoned Ambassador Vasquez to a private meeting and asked her directly what Earth was doing. Lena sat across from him in a chair designed for a species twice her size, her feet not quite touching the floor. She looked up at the towering insectoid diplomat who had called her people a statistical irrelevance, and she smiled. It was not a warm smile. "We are handling it ourselves, Speaker," she said, "as I promised we would." His mandibles clicked in what the translators rendered as irritation. "The Council has concerns about unilateral military action by a member species." "The Council had concerns about helping us too," Lena replied evenly, "and decided those concerns outweighed the lives of 1.2 million people. So I think we can agree that the Council's concerns are not particularly relevant to our decision-making at this moment." She stood and straightened her uniform, a small human woman in a room built for giants. "I would suggest that the Council observe what happens next very carefully, Speaker. It is going to be educational." In the darkness between stars, 14,000 warships turned their bows toward Crevon space and began to move. The light of their engines was so bright that astronomers on 3 different worlds would later report unexplained stellar phenomena in that region of space. Aboard the flagship Remembrance, Admiral Cade opened a secure channel to every ship in the fleet. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and absolutely certain. For New Geneva, no mercy, no forgetting. 14,000 voices acknowledged as one. Then they were gone, swallowed by faster-than-light corridors that would carry them to their targets in less than 72 hours. The wolves were running, and they were hungry, and the galaxy did not yet understand what that meant. The Crevon had ruled the edges of the galaxy for 8,000 years. In all that time, nobody had ever come for them. Not once. Not ever. That long, unbroken history of impunity had become so deeply woven into their identity that they had stopped thinking of it as luck and started thinking of it as destiny. They were wrong. The first strikes hit at exactly the same moment across all 5 Crevon home systems, synchronized to the millisecond by a network of quantum entangled communication relays that humanity had secretly seeded to the region over the past 3 years. Because humans didn't start wars on impulse. They started wars the way they did everything else, with meticulous, obsessive, almost frightening preparation. In the Crevon primary system, the gravity lances fired first, invisible beams that reached across the void and found the orbital defense platforms guarding the approaches to the home world. Those platforms, each one the size of a small moon, simply came apart, not in explosions, in silence, their metal and stone twisting and folding inward as localized singularities opened inside their structures and consumed them from within like an invisible hand crushing paper cups. The Crevon fleet station in orbit scrambled to respond. 3,000 warships crewed by the most feared raiders in the galaxy. They lasted exactly 11 minutes. The antimatter torpedo swarms hit them in waves. thousands of warheads moving in coordinated patterns that shifted and adapted in real time as the Crevon tried to form defensive formations. Every time the reptilian commanders adjusted their tactics, the swarms adjusted faster. The hive intelligence running the weapons was thinking at the speed of light. The Crevon were thinking at the speed of biology. Across the other four systems, the story repeated with mechanical precision. Human fleets appearing without warning, striking with coordination and ferocity the Crevon had never encountered in 8 millennia of raiding. Within the first hour, every Crevon fleet anchorage and orbital installation in all 5 systems had been reduced to expanding clouds of debris. On Athenium Prime, intelligence feeds lit up like a wildfire. The Veltari maintained the best intelligence network in the galaxy, and their monitoring systems in the region began streaming data to the Grand Deliberation Chamber in real time. Speaker Ithron ordered the feeds displayed on the main screens because he needed the Council to see what was happening, though he couldn't have explained exactly why he felt that need. The delegates watched. They watched human warships methodically dismantling the orbital infrastructure of 5 star systems. They watched tactical data scroll across screens, showing fleet compositions and weapon signatures that didn't match anything in the galactic database. The species they had dismissed as short-lived deathworld primates had been hiding a military capability that rivaled some of the Council's mid-tier powers. But that was only the beginning. On the Crevon homeworld, Warlord Scath stood in his command bunker and watched his empire's defenses disintegrate. He felt something he had never experienced in his long and violent life, a cold sensation in his chest that his species had almost entirely evolved past, but that still lingered in the deepest parts of their reptilian brains. Fear. He opened a broadcast channel on all frequencies and transmitted a message of surrender using formal protocols the Crevon had never needed to learn, but that were stored in their databases from ancient encounters with species that had tried and failed to challenge them. "We yield," he said, and his translator rendered it into trade common and human English simultaneously. "We acknowledge defeat. We surrender unconditionally." The response came from Admiral Roshan Cade aboard the UES Remembrance. It was brief. New Geneva did not get the chance to surrender. The assault continued. The hunter-killer drones descended on Crevon worlds like mechanical rain. Millions of them, each no larger than human fists, but carry enough processing power to identify and classify every structure on a planetary surface. They went to work with precision that was almost beautiful in its thoroughness. Military bases were dismantled piece by piece. Weapons melted. Power systems drained. Communication arrays reduced to scrap. The drones performed this work with such surgical accuracy that a barracks could be completely destroyed while the road beside it remained untouched. Shipyards that had built raiding vessels for thousands of years were taken apart bolt by bolt. Construction bays collapsed. Fuel reserves safely vented into space. Design databases wiped clean. When the drones finished, there was nothing left that could build so much as a shuttle. Weapons factories, research facilities, command centers, everything that had allowed the Crevon project power beyond their home systems was systematically and completely destroyed. Then the ground forces landed. This was the part that truly stunned the galaxy. Every species watching expected what came next to be a slaughter, a species-wide extermination carried out by a civilization consumed by rage. That was what the Crevon expected too, because it was what they would have done. It was what anyone would have done. It was what the galaxy understood. But the humans did not do what anyone expected. The ground forces deployed in patterns that military analysts across the galaxy would study for centuries. Not attack patterns, separation patterns, designed to identify and isolate combatants from non-combatants with efficiency that bordered on impossible. Crevon warriors who raised weapons were neutralized with lethal force and without hesitation. But Crevon civilians who did not resist were surrounded, contained, and left unharmed. The soldiers who carried out this process did so with discipline that made the watching galaxy deeply uneasy, because it meant the humans were not out of control. They were not lost in blind rage. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they had chosen every single aspect of it deliberately. Warlord Scath and his command staff were captured alive, pulled from their bunker by human soldiers who treated them with cold professional efficiency. They were informed through translators that they would face tribunal for crimes against humanity under Earth's jurisdiction. Scaff looked at the human soldier who restrained him, a woman half his size with flat mammalian eyes that held no hatred, no mercy, and no emotion at all. He understood, finally and too late, that he had not raided a colony of soft prey. He had kicked a nest of something the galaxy had not yet learned to name. In the grand deliberation chamber, 4,200 species watched this unfold in real time. The chamber was silent in a way it had never been silent before. Speaker Ithron's antennae had gone flat against his skull, pressed down in a posture that Veltari xenopsychologists would later confirm was an involuntary fear response the species had displayed collectively in over 6,000 years. The Orion delegates had ruffled every feather on their bodies, a display their culture associated with encountering something worthy of being recorded in eternal chronicles, something that would be remembered for as long as their species existed. The Danari had stopped talking. Trade voice Maluri sat in her seat with her enormous dark eyes fixed on the screens, her mouth closed. Her aides would later report this was the first time in recorded Danari history that an entire delegation had been rendered simultaneously speechless. Then came the final act. A single human vessel broke away from a fleet and moved toward a barren moon orbiting the Crevon homeworld, a lifeless rock with no atmosphere and no strategic value, but enormous cultural significance. The place where Crevon creation myths said their species had been born, a monument they had protected and revered for longer than most council species had existed. The vessel carried the ember. Admiral Cade broadcast one final message on all frequencies before the weapon was deployed. This moon is lifeless and empty. Nobody will die here today, but we want you to watch. We want the Crevon to watch. We want the galaxy to watch. Because this is what we chose to destroy instead of your cities and your children. And we want every civilization watching to understand what that choice means. The ember fired. The moon cracked slowly at first, a single line of fire splitting across its surface like a wound opening. Then more lines appeared, spreading outward in a web of molten light. The entire structure began to come apart in a cascade visible from the surface of the homeworld below, a new and terrible sun blooming in the sky that would remain visible for days. On the homeworld, Crevon civilians looked up at their sky and watched their sacred moon die. They understood the message that every other species in the galaxy also understood in that moment. The humans could have done this to us. They could have cracked our worlds the way they cracked that moon. They could have killed every one of us. They had the power and the reason and the rage. And they chose not to. That was more terrifying than any genocide could ever have been, because a species that destroys you is simply dangerous. But a species that could destroy you and deliberately chooses a different path, that is something else entirely. That is a species in control. And a species in control can make a different choice next time. In the grand deliberation chamber, Speaker Ithron watched the moon come apart on his screen and said nothing. For the first time in his very long life, he could not think of anything to say. The operation concluded in 97 hours from first shot to final deployment. When it was finished, the Crevon were no longer a spacefaring civilization. They were a species confined to their homeworld with no ships, no weapons, no orbital infrastructure, and no ability to threaten anyone ever again. Somewhere in the cold mathematics of galactic power, every intelligence agency on every world quietly updated their files on humanity. The new assessments all contain a single common conclusion that could be summarized in 5 words. Do not provoke the humans. 6 months after the fall of the Crevon, Ambassador Lena Vasquez walked into grand deliberation chamber of Athenium Prime and noticed immediately that her seat had been moved. For 3 years, she had sat in the outermost ring, so far from the center that speakers on the platform looked like insects. She had performed her duties from that distant seat, without complaint, because complaining would have changed nothing, and humans had learned long ago to save their energy for things that mattered. An attendant met her at the entrance, a small 4-armed creature whose species had served as the Council's administrative staff for 11,000 years. The attendant guided her forward, past the outer rings, past the middle rings, past the rows where mid-tier civilizations sat and traded favors and pretended to matter, all the way down to the inner ring, where the elder species held court, where the Veltari and the Orion and the Danari sat, where decisions were actually made. Her new seat was in the third row from the center, between the delegation from the Orion Concordance and a species called the Mithrani, who were so ancient they communicated primarily through controlled changes in the color of their skin. As Lena sat down, she felt the weight of several thousand eyes on her. Every single one of those eyes was seeing her differently than they had 6 months ago. The galaxy had changed. Everyone knew it. The thing that had changed, it wasn't the destruction of Crevon military power or the cracking of their sacred moon, or the 14,000 warships that had appeared from nowhere like a nightmare made of metal and light. The thing that had changed the galaxy was the fact that Earth had held back. Intelligence reports had flooded every capital in the months since Operation Carthage, compiled by analysts who had gone back through every piece of data they could find on human military capability. The conclusion was unanimous and deeply unsettling. The fleet that had dismantled the Crevon represented approximately 40% of Earth's total military strength. 40%. The humans had sent less than half of what they had, and that less than half had been enough to reduce a civilization that had terrorized the galaxy for 8,000 years to a pre-spaceflight society in under 4 days. The math was simple enough that even the most complacent diplomat could understand what it meant. If Earth ever decided to use everything it had, there were very few species in the galaxy that could stop them, and the ones that would pay a price so high that winning would feel exactly like losing. But the reports contained something else even more disturbing. Assessment of human psychology, attempts by galactic xenopsychologists to understand why humans had done what they did in the way they did it. Because the Crevon were still alive. Their military was gone. Their fleets were scrap. Their sacred moon was a ring of debris slowly spreading into a belt around their homeworld. But their people were alive. Their cities were standing. Their civilians had been separated from their warriors with such care that the casualty rate among non-combatants was less than 0.1%. A number so low that several species initially assumed it was a data error. The humans had been angry enough to cross the galaxy and tear apart an empire, and disciplined enough to do it without losing themselves in the process. That combination of fury and control was something the galaxy had simply never encountered before. Most species were capable of one or the other, but not both. And the ones that were capable of both usually didn't survive their own death worlds long enough to reach the stars. Dozens of species had quietly begun requesting diplomatic partnerships with Earth, trade agreements, mutual defense pacts. Cultural exchanges that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable. The requests were coming not from minor species looking for protection, but from major powers who had done the math and decided they would rather be friends with the humans than find out what it was like to be their enemies. The Danari had offered Earth a senior trade partnership, the fastest such elevation in the entire history of Collective. Trade voice Maluri had personally delivered the offer with what Lena had come to recognize as genuine respect in her enormous dark eyes. When Lena asked why the Danari had changed their position, Maluri said simply, "Because you are a good investment." 3 species that had voted against helping humanity in the original motion had sent formal apologies through diplomatic channels, worded carefully, expressing regret without admitting fault, the kind of language governments used when they knew they had been wrong, but couldn't afford to say so plainly. Lena had accepted the apologies with grace, because grace cost nothing and grudges were expensive. But she had also made sure the original vote record was entered into Earth's permanent diplomatic archive, where it would remain accessible for as long as human civilization existed. Because grace and forgetting were 2 very different things. Now she sat in her new seat in the inner ring and waited for the session to begin. When Speaker Ithron took the central platform, she noticed he looked at her first before addressing the chamber, a small gesture that would have meant nothing 6 months ago, but now meant everything. The session covered routine business for the first 2 hours. Trade agreements, border disputes, resource allocations, the ordinary machinery of galactic governance. Lena participated in discussions and cast her votes and was listened to when she spoke, which was a new experience she was still getting used to. Then, near the end of the session, Speaker Ithron departed from the agenda. He stood at the center of that vast crystal chamber and turned his angular, insectoid head toward the human delegation. He addressed Lena directly, a formal honor typically reserved for leaders of the great powers, one that had never been extended to a species as young as humanity. "Ambassador Vasquez," he said, and his voice carried through translation systems into 4,000 languages with a weight that silenced every side conversation in the chamber. The Council recognizes the changed circumstances in the galactic community and wishes to formally acknowledge Earth's role in the neutralization of the Crevon threat, a threat this body failed to address through collective action. He paused. Lena could see the effort it cost him to say the next words. The political calculation and personal pride warring behind those four compound eyes. What does humanity want? The chamber became so quiet that Lena could hear the hum of the crystal walls, that faint vibration you could feel in your teeth. She stood from her new seat in the inner ring and looked out at the assembly. For 1,200 species looked back, the ancient and the powerful and the wise, civilizations that had mapped the stars while humans were still learning to make fire. She saw in their eyes and faces and various sensory organs something she had waited 3 years to see. They were paying attention. She thought about New Geneva, about the glass planes where children had played, about the escape pods shot down one by one, about the message burned into the earth by creatures who thought humanity was nothing more than soft flesh and sweet fear. She thought about the council session, where she had begged for help and been told her people were a statistical irrelevance. She thought about the vote, 3,891 to 309. Each number a door slammed in the face of a species that had come to this chamber in good faith. She thought about Operation Carthage, about 14,000 warships crossing the void in silence, about Admiral Cade and his 6 words, about the hunter-killer drones and the gravity lances, and the ember blooming in the sky above a world that had learned too late what it meant to be human. She took a breath. What we have always wanted, she said, her voice steady and clear. A seat at this table, a voice that is heard, and the knowledge that the next time one of our colonies goes silent, you will not table a motion. You will not call our dead a statistical irrelevance. You will act, because now you know what happens when you do not. She sat down. The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough for delegates to look at each other and see their own unease reflected back, long enough for the full weight of what she had said to settle into the room, like something heavy and permanent. Then the Orion delegation signaled dissent, a formal gesture involving the spread of wing feathers that their culture used to acknowledge a truth that could not be argued with. The Danari followed. Then the Mithrani, their skin shifting through colors their neighbors' translators rendered as agreement and respect, and something older that didn't have a direct translation, but was close to the human concept of recognition. The acknowledgement that something you had overlooked had proven itself worthy of being seen. One by one, the delegation signaled dissent. Not all of them happily, but all of them understanding that the galaxy had rearranged itself around a simple truth that humanity had demonstrated with fire and restraint and blood. There are species in the galaxy that will endure anything, absorb any insult, survive any hardship, and never stop getting back up. Those species are not dangerous because they are strong. They are dangerous because they remember, and because their memory is longer than their patience. Speaker Ithron signaled dissent last, his antennae rising slowly from the flat fear posture they had held for 6 months. He looked at the human ambassador and inclined his head in a gesture his species used to acknowledge an equal, the first time he had ever made that gesture toward a human. After the session ended and delegates filed out through crystal corridors, a young Veltari diplomatic aide approached an elder colleague with a question that had been bothering him since he'd first read the intelligence reports on Operation Carthage. What does the human word vengeance truly mean? He asked. Our translators provide a definition, but it doesn't seem to capture what I saw in those reports. The elder Veltari stopped walking. He looked back toward the chamber where the human delegation was still gathered, and he watched Ambassador Vasquez shake hands with a line of diplomats who 6 months ago wouldn't have acknowledged her existence. It means they remember, the elder said quietly, in the way Veltari voices became quiet when saying something important. It means they never forget. It means that if you hurt them, they will carry that hurt across the stars and across the years. They will find you no matter how far you run or how long you hide. And when they find you, they will make you understand exactly what you did and exactly what it cost. He turned back to his young colleague, and his compound eyes held an expression the aide had never seen before on the face of Veltari elder, an expression that translated roughly as the wisdom that comes from learning something you wish you had never needed to learn. It means do not give him a reason, he said. "And if you do, then pray to whatever you believe in, because the humans will come, and they will remember everything, and they will not stop until the lesson is finished." The young aide looked back toward the chamber one more time, where the human ambassador was laughing at something a Danari diplomat had said, a warm, genuine laugh that echoed off the crystal walls. For just a moment, she looked like nothing more than what she was, a small woman from a small world who had come to the stars hoping to make friends. And that, the young aide thought, was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all, because you could never quite tell with humans whether you were looking at the diplomat or the wolf. And by the time you figured it out, it was already too late. 5 years after Operation Carthage, a delegation of young species, newly inducted into the Galactic Council, finding their footing among the ancient powers, requested a private meeting with Ambassador Vasquez. They came from worlds that had only recently achieved interstellar travel, worlds that were learning, as Earth had learned, what it meant to be young and small and overlooked in a galaxy dominated by civilizations that measure their histories in geological epochs. The meeting took place in one of the garden chambers of Athenium Prime, a crystalline dome filled with vegetation from 1,000 worlds, where the air smelled of alien flowers and the light filtered through leaves and colors that had no names in human languages. The delegation spokesperson was being named Kirith, from a species called the Torvani, tall and graceful, with skin that shimmered like oil on water. She sat across from Lena with her hands folded in a gesture that the translator indicated was respectful uncertainty. "Ambassador Vasquez," she began carefully, "we come seeking counsel." Lena waited, knowing there was more. Kirith glanced at her fellow delegates before continuing. "We have been members of the council for only 2 years. We sit in the outer rings, as you once did. We are told to be patient. That respect must be earned over millennia, that our concerns are premature, that we must wait our turn." The grand deliberation chamber of Athenium Prime was not merely large. It was architecturally impossible by the standards of most civilizations. Its crystalline walls soared upward into darkness, the ceiling lost somewhere in the perpetual twilight of artificial stars. The structure had been engineered with a singular purpose in mind, to make every being who entered understand their cosmic insignificance. For 1,200 species held seats within those ancient walls, arranged in concentric rings that spiraled upward from the central speaking platform like the interior of some vast, ethereal amphitheater. The architecture was deliberate, part cathedral, part courtroom, part monument to the accumulated weight of galactic history. The walls themselves were carved from pale crystal quarry from the heart of a dead star, shot through with veins of living stone that pulsed with bioluminescence. If you stood perfectly still and held your breath, you could feel a subtle vibration humming to the floor, resonating in your bones, in your teeth, in the deepest chambers of your heart. A reminder that this place was older than most civilizations and would endure long after they had turned to dust. Ambassador Lena Vasquez sat in the outermost ring, her assigned seat position so far from the central platform that the speakers below appeared as little more than insects against the pale glow of the chamber floor. She had learned, over her 3 years stationed here, that the distance was no accident. Every seat in the grand chamber had been calculated with mathematical precision, each placement a silent declaration of status, influence, and worth. Humanity had joined the Galactic Council 11 years ago, making them the youngest member species by a margin that beggared comprehension. 9,000 years separated Earth from the next most recent addition. In the vast hierarchy of galactic civilization, that made humanity something between an amusing curiosity and an elaborate joke. The kind of thing ancient powers notice the way you might notice a particularly industrious ant attempting to scale a mountain. Lena had heard all the names by now. She'd caught them in the hiss of translator static, in the pauses between diplomatic pleasantries, in the private channels where alien delegates thought no human ears were listening. Deathworld primates, gravity well screamers, short-lived meat that somehow learned to build ships. The epithets varied in creativity but shared a common theme. Humanity was beneath notice, a cosmic accident that had stumbled into the stars through dumb luck and stubborn persistence. She had trained herself not to flinch. Flinching was a luxury that ambassadors, particularly ambassadors representing species nobody respected, could not afford. The day's session concerned trade tariffs on helium, 3 extracted from gas giants in the outer spur, a subject so monumentally tedious that Lena had already watched two Orion delegates fall asleep standing upright, their feather heads tucking neatly beneath their wings in a gesture she secretly found endearing. The Orion possessed an enviable ability to sleep through anything that didn't directly threaten their trade interests, a skill Lena sometimes envied during particularly interminable debates about mining rights and resource allocation percentages. The Veltari speaker, a towering insectoid creature named Ithron, occupied the central platform. His voice rumbled through translation systems like the grinding of continental plates, each word measured and deliberate. His 4 compound eyes scanned the chamber with the mechanical patience of a species that measured time in centuries rather than decades, for whom the rise and fall of civilizations was merely another data point in an endless sequence. Lena watched him and reflected on power. The Veltari hegemony controlled nearly a third of council votes through an intricate web of alliances and client species that had taken 12,000 years to construct. They viewed humanity the way a mountain might regard a single ant attempting to scale its face, not with hostility, which would have required acknowledging humanity as a potential threat, but with a total and absolute indifference that was somehow infinitely worse. The Orion Concordance held the second largest voting bloc, a confederation of avian empires that valued honor and ancestral legacy above all else. They maintained detailed records of every battle their species had ever fought, going back 40,000 years, each conflict meticulously documented in crystalline archives that filled entire moons. They regarded humanity with puzzled fascination, the way a scholar might study a beetle that had inexplicably learned to dance. Interesting enough to warrant occasional observation, but hardly worth serious consideration. The Danari collective rounded out the trinity of great powers. Amphibious traders with slick blue-green skin and enormous dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, the Danari controlled the flow of galactic commerce with a grip so absolute that entire civilizations had risen or fallen based solely on whether the Danari decided to extend them a trade line. When the Danari looked at humanity, they saw only one thing, a small market, not yet worth the effort of exploitation. Perhaps in another few centuries, if the humans survive that long, they might become interesting. Lena had spent 3 years navigating this world of ancient powers and casual contempt. 3 years smiling at species who openly mocked her kind, attending diplomatic functions where she was seated at tables reserved for client species and insignificant polities, filing reports back to Earth that all said the same thing in increasingly creative variations. They do not take us seriously. They will not take us seriously until something forces them to. She had come to understand a fundamental truth about galactic civilization, one that nobody ever articulated, but everyone understood. Power was the only universal language, the only currency that truly mattered. Everything else, diplomacy, trade agreements, cultural exchange, even appeals to justice and shared values, was merely decoration draped over that single brutal reality. But Lena sat in her distant seat and performed her duties with meticulous care, because that was what humans did. They showed up. They kept showing up day after day, year after year, even when nobody wanted them there, even when an entire galaxy treated them like an inconvenient afterthought. She believed, with an intensity that bordered on religious conviction, that persistence was its own form of power. Perhaps the galaxy hadn't figured that out yet, but they would. Eventually, they always did. The Terror debate ground on for another 2 hours, a masterclass in bureaucratic tedium. Lena had just begun reviewing agriculture reports from the Martian colonies when her communicator buzzed against her wrist, a priority alert from Luna Command, the kind that only came through for genuine emergencies. She paused, and Lena saw something familiar in the being's eyes. Frustration mixed with resignation, the look of someone who had been told too many times that they didn't matter. "We wanted to ask," Kira continued, How did humanity make them listen?" Lena was quiet for a long moment, looking at these young species who had come to her for answers. She thought about all the easy lies she could tell them, all the diplomatic platitudes that would send them away satisfied and none the wiser. Instead, she told them the truth. "We didn't make them listen," she said. "We made them afraid not to." The delegates shifted uncomfortably. This was not what they had expected. "The galaxy," Lena continued, choosing her words with care, "operates on power. Not the power you display at diplomatic functions or the power you claim in speeches. Real power, the kind that changes calculations. The kind that makes ancient civilizations look at you and decide that accounting for your interests is cheaper than ignoring them. Kirith leaned forward. But how do we... I'm not finished, Lena said gently but firmly. The galaxy operates on power, yes, but there are different kinds of power, and the most important kind isn't the power to destroy. It's the power to restrain yourself from destroying. She stood and walked to the chamber's viewing window, looking out at the spires of Athenium Prime stretching toward an alien sky. When the Crevon attacked New Geneva, the galaxy expected us to die quietly or cry uselessly, or perhaps launch some ineffectual revenge raid that would make us feel better without changing anything. Instead, we showed them we could cross the void with 14,000 warships. We showed them we could tear apart a civilization that had endured for 8 millennia. And then, this is the important part, we showed them we could do all of that without losing ourselves in the process. She turned back to face the young delegates. That last part is what changed everything. Not the ships, not the weapons, the restraint. Because now, every time they look at humanity, they have to ask themselves, what would these beings do to us if we gave them a reason? And that question, that uncertainty, that fear, that's what makes them listen. Kiritha's shimmer patterns had changed to something the translator indicated was deep thought. So you're saying we need to threaten them? No, Lena said sharply. Threats are cheap. Threats are what weak species make when they want to pretend they're strong. I'm saying you need to be genuinely formidable. So formidable that you never need to make threats because everyone has already done the math. She sat back down, her expression softening slightly. But here's the thing they don't tell you in diplomatic training. You can't fake that kind of power. You can't bluff your way into the inner ring. The galaxy has been playing this game for millions of years. They can smell desperation. They can sense weakness. They know the difference between a species that has teeth and a species that's showing fangs it doesn't have. Then what do we do? Asked another delegate, a being whose species name Lena's translator rendered as the people of the long dark. We are not warriors. We are not. Neither were we, Lena interrupted. Humans didn't survive Earth because we were the strongest or the fastest or the most deadly. We survived because we were persistent and adaptable, and because we refused to accept extinction. We survived because we learned to use our minds to compensate for our bodies. We survived because we never, ever gave up. She looked at each of them in turn. You want my advice? Find your strength. Whatever made you survive your homeworld, whatever carried you to the stars, whatever drives you keep going when everything seems impossible, that's your power, not the power you wish you had, not the power you think you need to impress the council, your actual power, and then build on it, relentlessly, obsessively, without apology. And if that's not enough? Kirith asked quietly. Lena smiled, and it was not a gentle smile. Then you make enough. You work and you plan, and you build in secret if you have to, until the day comes when the galaxy looks at you and realizes you become something they can't afford to ignore. And if they hurt you before that day comes, if they dismiss you or mock you or let you suffer when they could have helped, you remember everything, and you make sure they understand that you remember. She stood again, signaling that the meeting was drawing to a close. The galaxy will tell you to be patient, she said, to wait your turn, to accept your place. And maybe that's fine for species that have millennia to waste. But if you're like we were, if you're young and mortal and you can feel time slipping away while ancient powers play games that will outlast your grandchildren's grandchildren, then patience isn't wisdom, it's suicide. The young delegates rose as well, their various forms of body language indicating they were processing everything she'd said. As they moved toward the chamber's exit, Kirith paused and looked back at Lena. Ambassador Vasquez, do you regret it? Operation Carthage, I mean, the message you sent. Lena was quiet for a long moment. I regret that it was necessary, she said finally. I regret that the galaxy forced us to choose between being ignored and being feared. I regret that 1 million people had to die before anyone would take us seriously. She walked to the chamber's entrance and placed her hand on the crystalline doorframe. But do I regret what we did? No, because now When human colonies send distress signals, ships come. When humans speak in council chambers, people listen. When humans ask for help, they receive it. And that's worth carrying the weight of what we did. She looked Kira directly in the eyes, or the equivalent sensory organs. The question you have to ask yourselves isn't whether you're willing to do terrible things. It's whether you're willing to accept the consequences of doing nothing. Because in this galaxy, at this table, with these powers, inaction has consequences too. Ask the people of New Geneva. After the young delegates left, Lena stood alone in the garden chamber for a while, surrounded by alien flowers and ancient light. Her communicator chimed. A message from Luna Command. Another successful diplomatic negotiation, another trade agreement finalized, another joint research initiative approved. Humanity's position in the galactic community continued to strengthen. Day by day, treaty by treaty, relationship by relationship. But also in the message was a briefing about increased military readiness drills, about new weapons research, about contingency plans for scenarios the public would never know about. Because the lesson of New Geneva hadn't just been learned by the galaxy, it had been learned by humanity too. Never again would they be weak. Never again would they be ignored. Never again would they trust the goodwill of ancient powers to protect their people. Lena closed the message and looked up through the dome at the stars beyond. Somewhere out there, the Crevon lived on their homeworld, their civilization reduced, but their species intact. A monument to restraint. A warning to anyone who might be considering whether humans were truly as dangerous as they seemed. And somewhere else out there, human ships patrolled human space. Human engineers built human weapons. Human strategists planned for human futures, all working under a single unofficial motto that had emerged in the years since Operation Carthage. We asked first. Those 3 words contained everything that needed to be said. The reminder that humanity had tried diplomacy, the acknowledgement that they had been refused, the justification for everything that came after, and the warning that they would ask again, but only once. Lena left the garden chamber and walked through the crystal corridors of Athenium Prime. Delegates from 100 species nodded respectfully as she passed. Some even stepped aside to let her go first, a gesture of deference that still occasionally caught her by surprise. She thought about the young species she had just counseled, about the advice she had given them, about whether she had said the right things or merely the true things. She thought about the galaxy that had changed around humanity, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. And she thought about the future, about the long arc of history, about whether humanity would use its newfound power wisely, or whether power would corrupt in the way it had corrupted so many species before them. But mostly, she thought about the children of New Geneva and the promise humanity had made to their memory. Never again, no matter what it cost, no matter who stood in the way, no matter how long it took. Never again. The wolves had learned to walk among sheep, had learned to sit at civilized tables and speak polite words and follow diplomatic protocols. But they had not forgotten how to hunt. And the galaxy, ancient, powerful, and wise, had learned to be very, very careful about reminding them, because humanity had asked first, and the answer they received had changed everything.